Number 10. Oldworld Disease. When Oldworld explorers and settlers came to the New World, they brought with them many things, from guns all the way to advanced shipbuilding techniques. The advances were unrivaled in how quickly they modernized the native populations. However, along with the advances and improvements they brought, the explorers also brought something else, something far more damaging. Diseases. Diseases that the explorers had developed immunities to, grown used to, or simply developed precautions for. All things which the native populations could not have anticipated the need for. The diseases that they brought included smallpox and measles, among others. These diseases are both potentially deadly and easily transferable, making them a problem when you don't know what you're dealing with or how to prevent the spread. Some estimates place the death toll at as high as 90% of the pre-exploration population, making this one of the most deadly events in human history. Number 9. The German Ninth Army. In the final days of the Second World War, the German High Command had fallen apart as the British, French, and American forces pushed into Berlin from the west, and the Soviets' Red Army marched across the German countryside into Berlin from the east. It soon became very clear to the Germans that the war had been lost. South of Berlin, the Ninth Army had been completely surrounded by the Red Army and was desperately fighting to break out of the encirclement. When orders came from what was left of the German command structure to break through and join up with the 12th Army nearby, the 9th Army decided to act. With the Soviets pushing harder and the Western Allies approaching the nearby River Elbe, the general in the 9th Army decided to carve out a path to the river, providing a corridor that the soldiers and civilians inside the Soviet encirclement could use to escape and surrender to the west. The 9th Army succeeded in breaking through to the river with the help of the 12th Army, and they provided protection for the civilians to cross. This act of bravery came with heavy losses, as 35,000 out of the 50,000 were killed, several thousand were captured, and over 10,000 civilians died while trying to escape. Number 8. European false teeth came from dead soldiers. Before modern dentistry and medical practices were developed, and before the need for proper oral care was fully understood, false teeth were a major undertaking to make. With the complete neglect of oral hygiene came the inevitable issues such neglect brings, such as rotting teeth and infections stemming from lesions and cuts on the gum and mouth. To aid in their comfort, if not their actual health, the wealthier people in society began using false teeth. False here meaning the teeth weren't their own teeth. Often the teeth would be from fallen soldiers or the poor who died on the streets. Of course, this practice also brought its own challenges, such as there being a shortage of viable teeth whenever there was no war going on close enough to make it economically viable to harvest the dead. One of the most notable occurrences of this tooth harvest is at the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated for the last time by the Duke of Wellington. With more than 65,000 bodies waiting, there was no shortfall in the number of teeth being taken from the fallen soldiers. Number 7. Rasputin. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was a Russian political elite and a mystic who was prominent in the Russian Empire leading up to the First World War. He was a close and trusted friend of Tsar Nicholas II, who would be the last Tsar of the Russian Empire. Being so close to the Tsar, Rasputin was accused of having undue influence over the Russian royal family, and swaying the choices of the Tsar in ways that were good for Rasputin, but bad for the Russian people. For these accusations, he was widely vilified while he was alive, and was the target of multiple assassination attempts. On the evening of December 30th, 1916, Rasputin was poisoned by a doctor loyal to the anti-royalist ideas. Though he quickly recovered from the poison, he was then shot directly in the chest, falling unconscious and then being kept in his rooms until he could be moved. To the surprise of his attackers, Rasputin recovered a few hours later and was made to leave, only for another man to put a revolver to his head and pull the trigger. Now confirmed to be dead, Rasputin's body was wrapped in a carpet and thrown into the Volga River. Number 6. Lord Byron had a pet bear in college. Lord George Byron, the famed British poet and author of Don Juan, better known to the public as simply Lord Byron, attended college at Trinity College in Cambridge in his early years. During this time, Lord Byron had quite the affinity for animals, and as such requested permission to have a dog in his dorm room, but was denied due to a rule forbidding dogs and similar pets from living on campus grounds. Lord Byron, upset at not being allowed to have a companion animal, decided to follow the rule to the letter. He acquired a bear cub and brought it with him to Trinity College in protest. Since the rule specified that pet dogs and other similar pets were not allowed, Lord Byron brought a wild animal that no sane person would consider a pet dog. In addition to the bear, Lord Byron had numerous other animals in his life, including but not limited to a multitude of horses, dogs, foxes, an eagle, and a few Egyptian cranes. Number 5. The Great Depression. The Great Depression was a time of great change around the world. Coming out of the fires of the First World War, the United States, as well as most countries in Europe, were on an economical high point. In the United States, this high was driven by the massive industrial boom that the First World War had caused in supplying the Allies with the material they needed to fight the Axis powers. In Europe, the boom was driven by the United States spending huge amounts of money to reconstruct the continent after the war had completely destroyed most of the industrial production capacity of the states there. In a moment of desperation following the market crash in 1929 that led to the dire economic situation of the Great Depression, many parents and children turned to sacks that held food such as flour or potatoes to make clothes, as buying new clothes became next to impossible. To help in this, the companies responsible for producing the sacks started to print different patterns on the sacks so that the people could at least make an attempt at fashion in the difficult times they found themselves in. Number 4. Involuntary Eugenics in the United States. The eugenics movement that took hold of America in the 19th and early 20th centuries began with the best possible intentions. The original goal of the American eugenics movement was to improve the quality of life for everybody by making the human race stronger and less prone to various diseases and genetic illnesses. Though altruistic in its origins, the movement quickly turned more sinister, thanks in large part to the movement being taken over by political elites who want to use it to keep themselves and their allies in power. Many of the movement's ideals, such as selective breeding, were changed to darker versions, such as forced sterilization. To make this situation even worse, the eugenics movement in America got popular enough that its followers would enforce the tenets on people who weren't deemed fit for procreation, sterilizing people too poor or of low social standing. Number 3. U.S. government overthrowing an elected government for corporate interests. The United States government has a long history of maintaining foreign interests related to itself. One such interest in the New World, following the Allied victory in Europe, was the nation of Guatemala in South America. In 1944, the popular revolution against a US-backed dictator in Guatemala led to the election of a socialist president, Juan Arevalo. When Arevalo began to implement the reforms he had promised his voters during the election, several US companies took notice. Most important among them was the United Fruit Company, now called Chiquita. The largest reform that Arevalo implemented was the sale of any unused land to the poor of the country, which angered United Fruits since their holdings were large in Guatemala and much of their land went unused because the bananas they grew did not require too much space. When the land reform was enacted, the United Fruit Company lobbied the US government to protest it. The US reacted by enabling the CIA to back a revolution against the legally elected socialist government and install their own dictator in 1954, which brought an end to the Guatemalan Revolution and raising of the poor out of poverty. While this new dictatorship did further destroy the lives of the poor, it did succeed in saving the United Fruit Company's profits when the dictator repealed the land reform. Number 2. Residential schools in the Canadian North. With the rise of Canada as an important player in the international community after the First World War and beyond, the government began to view the Native people as a problem in desperate need of a solution. Though they had considered it a problem since the late 1800s, the solution that was decided on was that the Native Americans needed to be converted to true Canadians and pushed away from their native roots. To accomplish this goal, the Canadian government set up an organization that ran a series of residential schools across Canada. To fill these schools with the natives they wished to convert, the government took children by the thousands from families across Canada, often moving them thousands of miles away from their family to completely separate them from the culture they had been raised in until that point. The families of the taken children were not permitted contact with these children afterwards. While in these schools, the treatment of the children was pretty damn horrific. After the school system was dismantled in 1996, stories came to light of physical abuse, sexual exploitation, and mental brainwashing. Along with the stories came a multitude of lawsuits raised against the federal government, many of which are being contested to this day. Number 1. The Finnish Winter War against the Soviet Union. Often overlooked in favor of the Second World War that it coincided with, the Winter War is one of the most brutal conflicts in modern history, with legends like the White Death's Timo Haya and the legendary general Karl Mannerheim emerging out of the conflict, starting in 1939 with the Soviet invasion of Finland, and continuing until peace was negotiated in 1940. The Winter War lasted through the opening year of the Second World War, often being considered as a theater of that war. Though the Soviets had more than double the men and 100 times as many tanks and armor as the Finns, the front was held by extensive use of delaying tactics and sabotage by the Finnish forces. Another factor that helped the Finns hold off the Soviets was that Joseph Stalin had spent 1937 purging the senior military ranks of people he considered to be possible risks, which left most of the senior military command and much of the middle command of the Soviet military filled by inexperienced officers. In 1940, the Finns successfully negotiated a peace treaty with the Soviets, after dealing out more than 50 times the expected casualties. Peace would not last, and in 1941, the Soviets again attacked, this time continuing to fight until 1944 when the Second World War ended for the Soviets and the Finns. This second phase is remembered in Finland as the continuation war.